expensive because it's worth it.
Between 1960 and 2016, the percentage of children growing up with just mothers nearly tripled, from 8 to 23%.
These aren't 20-year marriages that are breaking up. These are like 5-year marriages that are breaking up, which suggests to me a mental shift that's taken place in the nature of how we think about marriage, rather than socioeconomic status being the indicator.
2 of every 5 children in America are growing up without their fathers.
1 every 13 seconds there's a divorce in this country. That's true. 2.4 million people get divorced in the United States.
The people who are higher income tend to stay married more often than people who are lower income.
The earliest known divorce laws were written on clay tablets in ancient Mesopotamia around 2000 BCE.
Family court is one of the critical places where fathers are disadvantaged, and this hurts kids.
First-time marriages end in about 49%. That's the rate. Wow. But listen to this, Rachel. Marriage rates don't go down, they go up. Second-time marriages end in a divorce rate of 62%. And third-time marriages, if you're brave enough to get married for the third time, 73% failure rate.
The main contributors to fatherlessness are divorce and out-of-wedlock births.
Formally or informally, human societies across place and time have made rules to bind and dissolve couples.
The best my father clients could expect was every other weekend visitation and maybe a dinner on the off week. While significant legal progress has been made, this long-standing bias against fathers still occurs in the enforcement of custody orders, in child support rulings, and it exists in paternity laws. All the while, the number of kids growing up without dads continues to rise.
The stakes of who can obtain a divorce and why have always been high. Divorce is a battlefield for some of society's most urgent issues, including the roles of church and state, individual rights, and women's rights.
Men parent differently than women, big surprise. But their influence is crucial in the development of their children.
Following centuries of religious conflict, Europeans pushed for state governance separate from religious control. Secular courts gradually took over education, welfare, health, marriage, and divorce.
What I can tell you is that the data unequivocally tells us fathers are vital, and yet laws and society undervalue their importance, making it harder for them to be in their children's lives.
The 2 main reasons for divorce are, number 1, finances, and it's not what to do with the extra money. Second is communication.
This is what we know. Every bit of data we have tells us children need their fathers. The law, its application, and society at large disfavor fathers. But advocating for fathers isn't about diminishing mothers.
Due to the graphic nature of this program, listener discretion is advised.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to V Radio and Liberty Unleashed.
Hello, this is Liberty Unleashed, and my name's Brian. How's it going today, Neil?
Hi, my name is Neil, and this is V Radio. Today I'm having a Father's Day as a dad. I get to make all kinds of terrible dad jokes, and nobody can say anything about it.
That's true. That is a good point. The big plus about the day, and happy Father's Day to you.
Happy Father's Day to you too, Brian.
Oh, thank you, sir. How many children do you have?
I have 2.
I have 3 and then 2 stepchildren.
Oh, really? Do you step on them?
Yes.
See, there was a dad joke. A bad dad joke, but it was still a dad joke.
And I know, and I answered it too.
Yep, you answered it as badly as I told it.
Exactly.
Oh,
Yeah, they're good kids, all of them, and I'm great to have them in my life, to be honest with you. They're obviously with their dad today, the 2 stepchildren, but I've had my 3 kids today, and their attempt to spoil me was pretty good.
That's pretty good, definitely. I'm looking forward to that part of my day. That hasn't happened yet, though. I'm sure it will eventually. They usually surprise me.
That's good. There's the, I guess, the irony of our show today here on Father's Day as we talk about divorce.
Yep. And in specific, we're going to be discussing how the family court system shows a bias against fathers consistently. I'll probably be sharing some of my own anecdotes and, as they put it in the left, lived experiences. And we'll talk about the different perspectives on the issue from both the left and the right libertarian perspective.
Exactly. Interesting enough, as I was doing research for the show, as I always do, this thing where it doesn't favor men is actually recent, um, for most of history. And it's been divorce and marriage has been dictated mostly by religion. And so, therefore, in most cases, in most places, it favored men over the women. Now, that wasn't always the case, and that's not all the cultures out there. But when you're looking at the dominant, well, I shouldn't say dominant societies, that's probably the wrong word, but you got like Catholicism, the Catholic Church, and everything, where it's the larger religions, things like that. It's definitely has been in favor of men, and it's been recently that it's been turned around and not been in our favor. And I think, that's obvious. Anytime there's a fight to go to the government and demand the government creates laws and things for equal rights, the government does what they always do, which is mess things up and take it to the extreme. So rather than already finding an equality solution, they just reversed it. And it's like, well, for years it's favored men. Now it's going to, screw men.
Yep, definitely screw men as long as it's consensual. But yes, I totally get it. I think that one of the things that really I remember more than anything else was that when you're in the family court, it's depressing. Like there's just a whole lot of sad and scared and angry people all over the place. And I watched a documentary called Divorce Corp, meaning CORP, kind of like a play on words, to point out that the profit motive is heavily involved in every aspect of the divorce system. It's also the fact that the same person who might be your referee one day might literally be someone else's lawyer on another day. And these people all have relationships with each other. I had a lawyer friend at Occupy Wall Street who told me that she stopped trying to practice because you get to the court and you find out that, that the judge plays golf with your opponent. And then in many cases, these cases are decided before you even show up. That sort of thing also goes on in family court. And because family court doesn't have the same kind of, how would I put it, standards of evidence, you're just kind of trying to sway the opinion of the judge. And you can do this through a lot of underhanded means, which is definitely what I discovered. But the whole thing is designed very much for the state and also for lawyers themselves to make shitloads of money doing it. And they are very not happy when somebody tries to represent themselves, because at that point, you're not feeding into the pig trough.
You're taking away from the racket for sure.
Right.
And that's, I would say that's a lot throughout the even criminal justice system in the United States. It's not, the word justice is kind of put in there, but it doesn't really exist. There was a time sometime back where I did a cameo a cameo on your show before we were doing a show together like this again. And, we were talking about anarchism, and somebody had asked a question in the chat to me about criminal justice and about particularly courts, and in an anarchist society, would we have it? And I said, obviously no. In an anarchist society, it would not exist like it did today. And they said, no, thank you. I prefer to have a justice system. And I had to laugh at that, because if you've ever had any experience directly or indirectly with it, it's not, there's nothing, it's not even close to perfect. It's corrupted in so many levels. And as you were pointing out, judges and DAs go play golf together. There's just so many different aspects to it that, we could do a whole other show on just the corruption inside these courts and the racket of that. I think, the best thing I've ever heard was in that movie, The Murder of Crows, with Cuba Gooding Jr. The guy said, if it wasn't for attorneys, we wouldn't need attorneys. And I think he says it all right there. But interesting enough, in terms of divorce, I don't have direct experience with it. All my talk on this today is indirect experience. My current wife has been divorced. Obviously, if I have stepchildren, that would be the case. I've obviously had friends and family members who have been divorced, including my own parents. So I went through it as a child, watching my parents get a divorce. So while I didn't have to deal directly with the courts, I know a lot of what happens in there, and obviously the feelings of what happens with the judge deciding over other people's lives the way they do.
Yeah, and my experience with it definitely left a bad taste in my mouth, and I think honestly contributed to why I really don't have any interest in being married again. And it's the funny thing is I don't know. Some of it is also just the phase of my life that I've went into. I think I'm kind of past relationships at this point, but when you invite when you invite the state into your life when it comes to things like this, you have to be very careful about what the outcome is going to be. And unfortunately, because of the ways things are set up, in some cases you are kind of better off only because of the fact that if you don't, then the mother just kind of has all the power and you basically have none. And that's also a situation that shouldn't exist. But the primary thing that I would say, as far as in so much as like what Divorce Corp was trying to suggest. And Divorce Corp also brought up examples of women getting screwed over in the system too, because the woman in particular that they talked to, had an extraordinarily wealthy ex-husband, and he basically just got everything because he had way, more expensive lawyers, and those lawyers had better relationships with the judges. So just basically nothing that she could do was there. But like, one of the things that I found interesting, particularly when discussing this issue, like there's a famous video of the crazy radical feminists that they call Big Red, listing off all the reasons why men's rights activists should agree with feminists. But they suggested that what we are experiencing in the family court system is somehow a manifestation of the patriarchy. That the reason why men are treated essentially as guilty until proven innocent when you walk into family court, because that's the way it is. They say that is somehow an aspect of men staying on top of the situation. I can't wrap my head around that, but
I don't even know what to say to that.
that's I know, because they have a way to wrap everything around in that direction, and it's just ridiculous. I think that one of the things I distinctly remembered, for example, was if you show up at family court and you're a man, the assumption is that you are there to get more parenting time because you don't want to pay as much child support. So what would happen is,
Well, duh.
what would happen is I would be there for whatever motion I had to file. Usually it had to do with forcing my ex-wife to allow my kids to participate in sports or whatever she didn't want to be bothered to do. And the first question they would ask me is how far behind I was in child support. And when I would tell them, well, she's about 10,000 plus behind, if you want to look into it, they would get confused because the energy of the situation reminded me a lot of, like, let's say that we're all in a play together and we all have versions of the script, and then somebody, just to play a joke on you, slipped you a different version of the script, and everybody keeps looking up from their script confused at you, like, what are you reading? That's what it's like, because their version of the script is, you're definitely the one paying child support, and if there is any abuse, it's definitely coming from you. If there's any kind of like negative behavior or not caring about the kids, it's definitely coming from you. And what I tended to notice, especially because I always came prepared with evidence, with police reports, with CPS reports, whatever it is I needed, the more prepared I was, and the more that took them off their script, the more that would make the judges or magistrates nervous, and the less likely that they were to change anything. And it was a nightmare for years. And, especially with my kids caught in the middle of it, terrible things happen to them. I don't want to get into all of the gory details, but suffice it to say, as little kids, they did a good job of making sure that they never really talked to them about what was going on. And then when they did, it wasn't until they were teenagers that it even mattered. And this sort of thing plays out to many dads all over the country. And it's one of the reasons why I say to people, not just men, I say the same thing to women. It's not that kids are bad. It's not that having kids are bad. I wouldn't even say necessarily that marriage is bad. What you do need to be aware of, however, is you get one opportunity to choose who the other parent of your child is. And that's before conception. You get one opportunity to decide who the other family of your child is. And that's before conception. And once that decision is made, it cannot be unmade.
Yeah, it's true. When I was single and didn't have kids, it was easy to be judgmental of that and say, well, it's your fault. Like, as you said, you get that choice. Like, you should have known that person that you were having kids with. And I've seen friends go through with it. And unfortunately, it's not as black and white as it can sound, or you can feel like it would sound, particularly when you're not the one in that situation. Obviously there's been times where I've liked the person my friend was marrying, and then something changed after marriage happened. I mean,
Right.
some new things came to light or came out, or people changed, and it was very interesting to watch that unfold, like the dynamic completely change after that. But in terms of it, from a strictly freedom point of view, this is one of the things that I would say happens when you allow the government to license things, when you allow the government involved. In my opinion, the government should not license, define, or restrict personal relationships. But because we as a society kind of allow that to happen, obviously they license everything. They license us to drive, they license us to carry firearms, they license us to get married. And you look at, gay couples, it's only in the past 2 decades that they finally are getting equal rights in terms of marriage, being treated like husband and wife couple would be treated in terms of equal rights there. And again, this is what happens when you let the government license it. When you let the government involved in your personal relationship, you then got to go get the government to get you out of that personal relationship. And the government, there's nothing benevolent about government in any way. And there's nothing organized about government that you could say is good in my mind, in my experiences. I don't know if anybody I know has ever had good experience with the government. But again, when you start to let the government license, define, or restrict your personal relationship, this is part of what you have to deal with, the ugliness that you have to deal with when you go to a court, to deal with the divorce, to deal with child custody, to deal with child support, things like that.
So I want to take a moment to read this comment from one of my regulars, King Brandon. Think of having a family in terms of cost benefit equation. Society has been constantly adding costs and taking away the benefits. It's no wonder we're such a broken society. And this kind of plays into what I would also say that is different, is just that our values are different. Like, in some ways that's better, and in some ways it's not. I had a conversation not too long ago. Well, it was actually it was a while ago now, but it was with a great grandmother. One of those people who's in one of these relationships when they got married at like 15 somehow, and then are still together like 80 years later. She was a very blunt and funny person, but I asked her what she felt was the reason for the high divorce rates in our society, and she said, "Well, in my current experience, young couples treat their marriage like a disposable diaper. They shit on it and then throw it in the garbage and then go get another one." And she just laid it right out with both barrels. But I asked her to elaborate after chuckling, and she just said, "Well, it just the couples nowadays, they'll have like one malfunction in the bedroom or whatever, and then they're immediately off to the races to go find the next big thing." And I further elaborated with her on that, and I said that I kind of get the feeling that, especially in the United States, we find somebody that we are sexually attracted to, and then we project onto them who we want them to be. And then we also kind of misrepresent ourselves to some extent. This is that whole "I don't fart in front of my girlfriend" thing. And that the honeymoon phase is over the first time you do. But the other aspect of it was that, it's known that during the initial part of a relationship, there is what a honeymoon phase where your hormones are crazy. And, if that fades away, then some of the young couples just think that that means they're no longer in love. And so we have made divorce too easy to a point now that people really have no incentive to try to make it work, was kind of her point. And,
I think it's
I would agree with
perceived
that.
as easy, not so much we made it easy. States are different, watching my friends and, my current wife go through her divorce. I wouldn't call it necessarily easy, perceived to be easy. And that's a great point that you were making, or that, the lady you were talking about was making, because I was thinking about that, not just before the show, but other times. My grandparents, I'm sure your grandparents, most of my friends, almost all my friends, their grandparents were all together until the death did them part in some way. I mean, I knew multiple people who had their 25th or silver anniversary. And then, when it came to the baby boomers, my parents' era, there was still longevity in the relationship, but there was more divorces than their parents and their grandparents. And so if you looked at like my great grandparents, I mean, again, they were together until death do us part, in terms of that go. And then now our generation, we're the kids of the baby boomers. And I think, the stat said at the beginning of the show that 50% of us will get divorced at the first, in the first marriage. And that's an interesting thing that it's been going like that. That it's kind of just become, as you said, I would say, perceived easier and easier to get a divorce, and over the littlest things. I mean, I think that was the point you were making from that story. One little thing goes wrong and it's like, oh, well, he's a bastard, or she sucks, I don't like her anymore, so you're out. And I think, my grandparents, and their parents, they were committed. They looked at marriage as a big deal, an important step in life, and a commitment. And I think that that's something that is gone from our generation. We don't take it and look at it as the same commitment as our parents or our grandparents did.
Right. And there's definitely a societal thing. I do remember, for example, when I was a kid, I still remember there being a stigma about being someone who was divorced. Like, people would look
Yes.
down on you.
Yeah.
And that's not really the case anymore. And I think that what we were imagining in our heads was the reason for that. Like, is why do we need to make divorce easier? Is the person in, say, an abusive relationship? Obviously, that person needs to be able to get a divorce. They shouldn't be forced to be in that situation. But now, I think it just kind of further eroded what we believe relationships are, even what family is. Like, I remember, for example, kind of coming to this conclusion when I was in the middle of my custody battle. And of course, for that reason, not exactly for that reason, but this was my luck, right? The water heater gave out and soaked into the floor. And it just so happened to be that it destroyed the floor in the room that my kids were both in at the time. They were both little, so they had bunk beds. And I posted on Facebook, hey, I need help with this. This is bad, and then my family members on Facebook said things like, well, this is why people have homeowners insurance, and like really a whole lot of nothing helpful. My friends, on the other hand, are like, we'll be there tomorrow, and they showed up with saws and wood and we fixed the floor. Right.
Right.
That used to be something that would have been reversed, right? Your friends would have given you maybe some useless advice, and your family would have been over the very next day, fixing your house. There is no relationship like that anymore. I kind of, unfortunately, more or less just kind of stopped talking to the majority of my family because it seemed like their only contribution was to give me useless advice or just to look down on me or judge me.
I say, or to criticize or judge. Yeah.
Right, but nothing that actually would have normally have been expected from family back in the day. I mean, I'm not saying you wouldn't get any criticism. Like, let's say, I don't know, 50 years ago, your dad would have came over to fix your floor, and then as he was fixing your floor, would explain to you that this is why you need homeowners insurance.
Right.
Right. Yeah. But
in the condescending tone of, I told you so, how many times do I have to tell you, you should have done this?
Right, exactly. And instead, what we have now is just a situation where they're not really helping us. But that's, go ahead and you make your reply, and then I want to bring up some statistics.
Yeah, well, looking back as we talk about our grandparents and great grandparents, for my grandparents, they were religious. They went to church. My parents gave us the choice of going to church or not. They weren't religious, but if we wanted to go with our grandparents, and in general, if you're not religious, you generally take the bad parts of religion and say, this is why I don't like it. This is why I don't like church. This is why I don't like religion. And not all churches and religion are great in that terms. I mean, looking at all the child abuse cases that the Catholic Church had throughout the years and what's been exposed is horrible.
Right.
But that doesn't reflect all churches. And, for my grandparents, their pastor was their marriage counselor. If they were having marriage problems, they would go to the pastor, and it wasn't like they went to some therapist. They went to him, and, they sat down with the pastor and worked it out and talked it out.
I got to stop you. You're saying pasture and you mean pastor.
Pastor, thank you.
If they went to the pasture to deal with their marital problems,
as soon as you corrected me, I
serious shit.
I heard myself. Yes.
There's enough bullshit in the marriage. We don't have to go to the pasture. I'm sorry.
It's been a long
Okay.
weekend,
So,
okay?
so the pastor. So
Yeah, the
tell us
past.
about the pastor, not the pasture.
Well, that's something my grandma would have said. I'm still, it goes in the blood.
Right.
But
Blame her. Blame
anyway,
her.
yeah, but she's not around to defend herself, so it's easy. But
Right.
anyway, my point is that, religion really had a lot of say in marriage and divorce, particularly before the 1960s when you look at the history of all this. And again, they looked at it as a big commitment. But when the states didn't get involved, it was probably around the French Revolution where people started wanting non-secular solutions to getting out of divorce. And, so they started to go to the state in that regard, and the state got involved, and you had judges and everybody instead of your pastor.
Right.
But anyway, and then you had to usually prove, the point I'm trying to make is you had to usually prove that there was some wrongdoing, some reason. There was an adultery, there was abuse, something that was legitimate where the person who was helping you get out of divorce would say, okay, I can see why you should not be in this relationship anymore. In the 1960s and 70s, particularly in the United States, they adopted a no-fault divorce laws, which basically exactly as it is. There doesn't have to be a fault. You can just not want to be in that relationship anymore, and you're out. Now, from a libertarian point of view, that works for me, okay? Because obviously, I don't want to have to prove to some judge or somebody something if I want to make a decision in my life. I don't need somebody else telling me what I can and cannot do. But if you're trying to trace back and look and see what are causes of it, that might be, in a historical point of view, some of the reasons why we're at where we're at today with 50% of our generation getting a divorce after we get married. So, if you're going to allow the government to license and be involved in it, then I would say naturally you would have to have no fault laws, no fault, in terms of that goes. I don't think you should have to prove something, that somebody was committing adultery or abuse to get at it if you don't want to be there. And as we move on and talk about child support and child custody, that's where I get into, again, from a libertarian point of view, like just watching throughout the years, Judge Grant, like, you can only see your kid every other weekend. It just blows my mind that people in a quote unquote free society allowed that to happen.
Yeah, that, and you definitely get hit over the head with that. I happen to live in an estate where they will take out a club with the words joint custody written on it, and they will hit you until you accept it, more or less. And they try to scare you out of going to court to get anything different. And it ended up like, in some cases, I mean, I would say joint custody is certainly more fair. It's just what they initially wanted was for us to trade the kids every 2 days, which thankfully enough, even my ex-wife was like, no, that's not going to happen. Right. Like, where are they going to go to school? Who's going to, like, it wasn't even practical, but at the end of the day, though, it is still unusual. And that's what these statistics I'm about to read from say. Recent studies estimate that mothers receive primary custody 68 to 88% of the time, while fathers receive primary custody in only 8 to 14% of child custody cases, and equal custody is ordered only 2 to 6% of cases. So this is a huge difference. 8 to 14 as compared to 68 to 88. And I remember, like, because we had to take these special courses when we were getting divorced, and a roommate of mine was there with me, and he knew the judge because it was the same judge that presided over his divorce. Like, not his divorce, but when he was a kid, meaning like he was the kid and the parents were divorced. He's like, well, this judge totally favors women. And he's like, and he was worried for me. I was like, well, don't worry. He's not presiding over my divorce. He's just teaching this course. And because I had that opportunity, I just point blank asked him, is it true, that judges favor women over men? And he gave this ridiculous explanation, something along the lines of, well, men don't want to do things like wipe kids' noses and all of that. And I'm just kind of shrugging, thinking to myself, dude, I freaking scrape poop off their butt with my hands when I'm changing their diaper. I don't care about wiping their noses. I was like, so that might have been an example maybe of an old school patriarchal way of thinking, I guess. But when you go into the system, beyond the few male judges that I ran into, literally everyone else I dealt with, whether it was family court, like whether it was Friend of the Court, which is actually a private organization that is not actually state affiliated. Most people don't know that. Or CPS. I've got some great adventures in dealing with them because people weaponize CPS to try to help them in custody battles. So I'd have CPS, at my door at least once a week, and it ended up helping me in the long run because as a consequence of that, I had all these official reports saying there really wasn't anything wrong going on in my house, but it did create this crazy siege mentality. But back to the main point, I dealt with a single male CPS agent ever. I dealt with just one male judge who I almost never saw because just about everything else was dealt with via the referee, who was a female, and all the women behind the counter. When you go to Friend of the Court, they're all female, and it's not to say necessarily that there's this huge conspiracy. As Jordan Peterson points out, women are more interested in social work because in general, not a rule, but a guideline, just through normal behavior, women are usually more interested in people and men are usually more interested in things. However, when you get there, it is extraordinarily clear these are not women trying to uphold men's rights. They definitely have an agenda. They definitely have a bent, and it's not in your favor.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of cases, I don't think it's in anybody's favor. I sit there and try to say it's the best thing for the kids, and then grant every other weekend to see their father. There's it's not in anybody's favor. From that comes from what they call the tender years doctrine, by the way, and it was meant to. They figured that from the ages of birth to 4 years old, kids were really needed their mothers, that they needed that nurturing mother. And so they created the 10 years doctrine, and therefore the mothers got the custody of young kids. It just kind of kept going past 4 years old. And they obviously learned otherwise through, research, stats, and everything else, that even 0 to 4 kids still need their father. There was just this, however this comes to somebody publishing a paper and everybody latching onto it, like we've seen that happen before with other things, including, what we're dealing with right now with the pronouns and everything like that. But so, yeah, what we're trying to do and what was pointed out, I think Marilyn York, who I had in the intro videos, she was an attorney who represented men's rights in family law. And, she talked about that in there in terms of the tender laws and how the laws are still stacked against men, and the percentages, while they understand now that fatherless homes or not seeing the father that much has detrimental effects. It takes so long with government to change things and to get things changed around. And obviously, as we talked about earlier, that racket, it takes money to do it as well.
Yeah, and as King Brandon pointed out in the chat, that he would wager that in many cases the men do get, the custody. It's probably because they had very good legal representation. And that's a
Right.
major part of the racket altogether. I had people whose jobs it was to file the papers literally just look at me with disgusted looks on their faces and tell me that I had to get a lawyer. So it was very clear that they weren't happy that I didn't have one. And I'm like, is the paperwork filled out correctly? They're like, well, yes. I'm like, got it. Can you just file that for me? It's like, and then I would leave and think to myself, yeah, and you can shut the fuck up. I don't care about your opinion. But the thing is though, the only reason I had as much luck as I did is I'm pretty good at reading that stuff. And I didn't have the money, right? And she did have a very expensive lawyer. And that's what allowed her to continue to have, I would say, involvement in our children's lives, despite constant nonstop situations of my children being put in danger, of them being abused. Like at one point, my daughter's arm was mysteriously broken. These are the kinds of things that were going on. And whenever, whenever I'd go to family court with evidence of this kind of stuff, you could see the judge or magistrate, as it usually was, or referee, get very nervous, and then not really know how to react because it was so unusual to them. But that comes back to another thing when I say like the burden of proof is not the same. You're allowed to essentially submit evidence that would never be allowed in a criminal case. You're allowed to do all sorts of things that are basically just kind of emotional and pleading to the witnesses and all that. I remember you're also allowed to just do straight up deceptive and totally wrong stuff. I remember generally at the outset of every encounter that I had when I was dealing with anyone in the court system, my ex-wife would always claim that there was domestic violence. And fortunately enough, I had a stack of papers that proved that that wasn't the case, because she would call the cops, they wouldn't find anything wrong, and then we would move on, because she would give up on it because she'd realized it was proven wrong. But that didn't change the fact that the energy of the situation was changed entirely in the room, just because of the accusation being thrown out there.
Yeah, and I think men have to essentially walk on eggshells or glass once it happens. I mean, if the woman were to accuse the man of abuse, everybody would be on top of it immediately. If you were to accuse your ex-wife of abuse, everybody would question and be like, yeah, he's probably just saying that because he wants something. It's very hard. They tend to have a hard time believing that the woman would commit any abuse, but it's like easy to accept that men will and do. And I found that interesting, even from indirect experience, when watching friends and family go through the courts with that kind of thing. The modern system right now, where the judge basically gives full custody to the woman, or your man gets to see it every other weekend, has allowed the children to be used as weapons against the men. The women have been allowed to, if you don't do this and you don't do that, I'll take you back to court for this or that. And there's a lot of things that caused me to become libertarian and hate the government. And watching divorce courts and how those decisions being made, it's one of them. It's not the main thing, of course, but it's definitely one of those things that continues to drive me and make me hate government and government policies. And I'm surprised that libertarianism is not as popular in this country as you think it would be, that both the Republican and Democrat Party are still dominant and people still follow them like they do. It just amazes me. And what also amazes me is throughout all this, the Congress and state legislators were dominant with men. We basically made the laws to hurt ourselves, to hurt other men. When I started to look up women in Congress, particularly in like the 70s and 80s, there were very few in Congress. So it wasn't like this was women making laws to go against men, like, screw you guys. Men were doing it to each other. And I just, to this day, as I said earlier, I can't imagine if a judge told me that I could see my kids every other weekend. My comment out loud to him and the whole court would be, who the fuck do you think you are to tell me when I get to see my kids? It's not happening that way. And I will put every money and resource I have into making sure that that's not the case. I don't care how many times you hold me in contempt of court, try to lock me up. You have no right to dictate to me how often I see my children. And to watch friends and family roll over and just accept that throughout my life. I'm not saying that I blame them completely. They felt like the cards were stacked against them for sure. And definitely I feel like they're right. It was stacked against them. But I feel in my personal opinion, I would put up much more of a fight than I watched any of them do. Thankfully, I'm in a happy, healthy relationship and I don't have to worry about that. But it's, to me, again, that it's one of the things that drove me towards libertarianism and despising the government and wanting them out of our lives, out of our personal lives, because the children statistically are affected the most. Marilyn York goes over that. We touched on some of that in the intro video. We sit there and we talk about the crime today. We talk about the high rate of teenage suicide, and a lot of that is contributed to fatherless households.
Right. And that is definitely another major aspect that they're starting to understand also contributes to criminal behavior on the part of kids, is not having fathers in the households.
Yeah.
And, before we get too far into that, I do want to take a moment to make a comment on, again, some statistics, but I have here the statistics that point out on Statista that women actually are more often the perpetrators of child abuse than men are. And, it's still a fairly close margin, don't get me wrong. It doesn't change the fact that this is another example of a statistic that feminists would never really want to see the light of day. And I'm sure they'd have some kind of excuse for it, because they would use statistics like these to justify basically anything else in their, that in their agenda. The same thing would be true of most woke activists. And, that I remember one of the most chilling aspects of the whole thing was all the times that I had to drop my kids off to her because she was a bit mentally crazy. I would think about the stories of the women who murdered their kids, and it would always scare the hell out of me. I got over it more later when they got older and were more capable of dealing with the situation. But, but still, this is an aspect of things, and an aspect of the reality of the situation that people don't talk about.
Well, and I mean, you would agree that the perception out there is that women are, with the stats that you're showing, the perception is that women aren't that high as the stats are suggesting, that it's mostly men who are capable of the abuse. And I'm not, again, your stats say otherwise, that it's about equal, but perception is men.
But abusing the children, not the spouse. This is
right.
about,
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, either gender is capable of abusing young children when they're smaller than them. But I know what you're saying.
Right. Again, it's perception. I would ask you, do you feel modern day, do you feel like there is a war against men? Like there is this thing, like, we have that term toxic masculinity going on, which wasn't the case that I remember growing up. And the way I perceive it, again, is if you're with, the quote unquote alpha type male, they consider you toxic. Do you feel that's the same?
It's definitely a problem. And it's weird because, okay, so funny thing about that is that, because I've dealt with a lot of, woke activists in my life, is that the traits that they claim that they want men to have, being sensitive, being like, these are all traits that women are not attracted to. Like, I mean, I don't like that that's true, but it is. It doesn't mean that women need to be attracted to abusive people, and that's not the same thing, but they like strong personalities. And that's
Right.
just a natural phenomenon, right? And there are exceptions. These are, again, just guidelines. Usually what I would find is that, for both men and for women, the lower their IQ is, the more they're likely to be driven by their base instincts and less by their, their ability to think clearly. But you can't really control who you're attracted to. As far as what toxic masculinity is, the problem is it's a term that gets thrown around, and it means different things to different people. I mean, like, I did a video called Strong Women, Who Are They? And it was specifically about addressing, well, first of all, what a real strong woman is, and second of all, what is toxic feminine? And what I found toxic feminine to be would be the kind of girls that, for example, maybe they know they're attractive, maybe they know that they have a certain degree of control over the men around them, and then they use that to negative ends, right? I would call that toxic feminine. With toxic masculinity, though, they want even just 80s action heroes to be labeled toxic masculinity. They want, just honestly, just men who are not just subservient all the time are, in their opinion, toxically masculine.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I would tend to agree with that. Watching, other people in the situation, I feel I'm lucky. You talk about you get one chance to know who you're having children with, and before I was with who I'm with now, obviously I was on the dating scene, and I had kind of my own rule. It was the who I would take home to meet mom, and
Right.
I it's so again, I could be attracted to a woman and want to sleep with her, but I had that scale. Like, right before the woman I'm with now, I was seeing somebody, and she wasn't on the woman I'd take home to meet mom. She was fun to hang out with and fun to be with, but there was something about her that said, this is not long term. I don't want this person long term. I'll have fun until I find the long term person. The woman I'm with now is a wonderful woman. I think that what people would label as toxic masculinity, that's the part that she loves about me. She says I make her feel safe, that she feels safe around me. We don't fight in terms of yelling and scream at each other. We do have our disagreements, but we are able to talk about that and say, she can say, I don't appreciate the way you talked to me the other day when we were talking about this, and we can break it down. I can either apologize or I can explain my way. Usually I still end up apologizing, of course, but not because I was forced to, not because she's going to make me sleep on the couch. And I always found that interesting. Like, there was never going to be a time where somebody could tell me to sleep on the couch because they're mad at me.
Right.
So every time I saw and heard those scenarios, I kind of chuckled. And then, I had people say, yeah, well, let's wait until you're married and see what happens. And to this day, I've never had to sleep on the couch. So, um, and nor would I. I'd be like, if I was told that I was going to sleep on the couch because they're mad at me, I'd be like, hey, you're the one who's mad. You better get on the couch. That would be my reply. you know. But what I've seen, and when I bring up the toxic masculinity, what I saw in the past through friends and family who got divorced was there's this level of the man not sharing in certain household chores and other things, and eventually they were labeled as worthless. And I remember, my wife and I had this conversation, and I said, look, I know you need help with some of this stuff, and I'm not against helping you, but please recognize something. I do all the heavy lifting around here. I do the yard work. I do the fix anything that gets broken. I do the open the jars that people can't open. And I don't ask for help. I don't come and say, oh, it's so hard, I need your help. If you want to trade, if you want to do the yard work, I'll gladly go fold the laundry. Because trust me, sweating out there in the middle of July in Pennsylvania isn't all it's cracked up to be. So
Sure.
we had these conversations, and I mean, I guess watching other people, I'm thinking maybe they didn't have these conversations. Maybe they went from, somebody resenting somebody for not helping with the laundry or something straight to arguing without having the conversation. And what I didn't want to be is in that same boat where she's talking to her friends and saying, oh, well, he never helps with the dishes. And her friends saying, well, he's worthless, you should divorce him. I wanted to point out that you don't ever help with the yard, or you don't help fix the roof, or, you don't help when the toilet is shooting water straight in the air. Those are all things that I dive in and do, and I get done for the household. And so, I think obviously that's part of a good relationship. Having a good relationship is being able to have those conversations and recognize that both parties do stuff for the household. I'm the breadwinner. I go to work all day. She's a stay-at-home mom. I'm not taking anything away from staying home with the kids. I can see how you can pull your hair out at the end of the day by having kids. But she doesn't want to go to work either. She hates the concept of, sitting in a cubicle or going to work. So she'd rather be home with the kids. And for the longest time, I think that's been the case. The women stayed home with the kids, the men went to work and provided for the family, and that was understood. So we had conversations like, you're home all day with them. Seems like you have the opportunity to get the laundry done, and I shouldn't have to come home after a long day of work and help with that. If you need help, if something happened, please let me know. I'm not against helping you. I'm not saying I'll never help, but as a person who's working all day and dealing with that side of it, paying the bills and all that, then I think, you've got your level of responsibility for staying home and being the housewife. And I think that's, where we talk a lot about toxic masculinity and people saying, well, that's sexist, the thing that always made me laugh was Bill Burr's skit. I don't know if you saw it, about where he was talking about being a stay-at-home mom and how they said that's the roughest job out there. And he goes, I don't know. I thought being a roofer in the middle of July was tougher than that.
Well, I agree with that. I do want to point out, though, that doesn't have to be like, I mean, I've been the stay-at-home dad before, too. Like there were times when that's a thing.
Well, no, and I'm fine. I know friends who are stay-at-home dads. I'm not.
Right.
Staying at home is a job on its own too, but that's my point. You
Mhm.
have responsibilities with that job, just like if you go to work, you have responsibilities. At the end of the day, both parties should come together. And again, my point was we did come together. I tackled the heavy lifting, hard stuff. She should tackle some of the other stuff. That's how it's perceived. She and not perceived, but that's how it is at our house. I mean, she does really good at, making dinner and things like that, instead of, well, sorry you worked all day, but you're on your own. It's not like that. And I mean, I've seen relationships like that, and that was my point. And it's like, of course you can see that leading to divorce. There's no compromise there. There's no working together in any way. And I find that sad, obviously, that people can't sit down and communicate and separate that.
Right. And and also just kind of getting into, well, what is it we mean by the father's role in the home is another thing that I think that the modern world needs to kind of come to terms with. Like I remember because, you know, um, I usually bring this up because I still work with kids as a coach. I work with kids when I worked at restaurants and stuff, there would always be the ones that had those play places in them and all that. I've been up to my, ears in kids, and then I am a father. And one of the things I noticed was that there's this huge problem with discipline nowadays. And everybody says that, about the next generation, right? But there's definitely something different. I mean, I remember when I was at the play place, and this sweet grandmother had taken their grandson to the play place, and it was time to go, and she was sweetly trying to tell him that he needed to go, and then he's cussing at his grandmother. And I'm like, bro, like
Right.
I can hear my mom's voice in the back of my head. Like, what is a matter? Like, and it just, that was not like okay, Gen X kids were not doing that to boomers that I'm aware of, right? There's something different here.
Well, and we had to just wait until your father gets home. If my mom said those words, we usually straightened up.
Right.
'Cause my
But what
father was
was
no
the
doubt
role?
going to pull the belt out and, whoop our ass for something my mom said we did. In terms of that. Now, and that's the other thing. My father, later in years complained about that and said that he hated coming home and having to be the bad guy. He wanted to come home and, play with his kids, have fun with his kids, not make his kids cry and hurt.
Right.
But obviously there was discipline that needed to happen there, in terms of that. We don't, in our household, I don't spank the kids. We don't pull the belt out and do that. And I do sometimes in the back of my mind worry what they're going to be like as they get older. Now, we don't let them get away with stuff. We still sit there and constantly stop that. We told you stop that, go into timeout, depending on their age and their size and what the punishment is. Right now, it's take some toys away from them. Hey, you did this, so we're going to take some toys away from you. And to real quick elaborate, as I make the point about coming home from the end of the day at work and not wanting to do things, we did recognize, and I do recognize, that she also needs a break at the end of the day too. Dealing with the kids all day is exhausting, and I'm not the only one who needs a break just because I worked all day. She worked all day too, so we have to find ways to compromise and give each other some time to have a release and a break. It's not all me just sit on the couch and watch sports and eat a TV dinner or whatever. She also has to have her time to decompress. But yeah, in terms of discipline and all that, that's something that I've always wondered. I don't necessarily think that spanking and hitting kids is a good idea, but clearly it had some effect on us growing up and made us different than what you're talking about the kids today in terms of respect and all that. And like I said, it sits in the back of my mind. We don't spank the kids, so I'm just hoping that I'm not going to regret that.
Well, I think that it's important to understand that it's not my first, second, third, or fourth choice, nor was it for my mother,
Right.
but it's the problem that I had with it as it unfolded was that there's a really good article. It's called The Science on Spanking is Short on Science and High on Emotion. And it was in Psychology Today. And they were just discussing the fact that there are laws just being passed against it, period. And CPS will take your kids. Like the thing is that the same experts, and this is another classic example of scientific malpractice, because the most widely distributed study took data from kids who were just paddled in the more traditional sense. No marks are left, just that, right? And then they threw the data as far as like the future of those children when it came to were they criminals, were they suicidal, were they violent, whatever. They threw that data of these kids who were paddled with the kids who were brutally beaten and then said, see, all corporal punishment leads to the following outcomes, right? Stefan Molyneux used to spew this all the time. I'm not sure if you remember him, but he was a big libertarian guy. I debated him a couple times back in the day. But the problem is that I'm willing to accept that there are going to be alternatives, right? The thing is that the majority of the alternatives that have been given to me usually are not very realistic. And as the whole situation progresses, now they have articles about no yelling, and then they have articles about no timeouts, and then they have articles where some people are literally saying no punishment at all, right? And when you start to break down the science, you realize, wow, I don't know that necessarily that they really thought this through. And what I'm concerned about is that what we are noticing is that despite all of the coddling that we are told to do as parents, There was another article in Psychology Today that brought up that student resilience is a serious problem on college campuses. And what they were meaning is that our young adults are getting to college and they have no coping skills. They have no ability to handle adversity at all. And frequently they ended up calling their parents to handle all of their problems again, which was not a problem that was as common to Gen X, certainly wasn't as common to boomers. But we were supposedly doing all of these quote unquote new parenting things to protect their self esteem, to protect their confidence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not working. And what I worry about in our future is that the genie is something that's going to be hard to put back in the bottle, right? So let's say, I don't know, 30 years down the line, we find out that no, spanking really is the right thing. And I'm not saying necessarily that it is. You're going to tell, the great grandkids of the current generation who, that, okay, now we got to go back to spanking kids, right? Or now we have to yell at them, or, it's the kind of thing that I'm concerned that society will not realize the long-term consequences for. And the final point that I would make is that these kids are not all the same. Like, kids have different levels of self-control, of impulsiveness. And frequently, one of the things that I would run into is because all the people who are proponents of this stuff frequently will say things like, well, my kids are perfect angels and I never yell at them or anything. And I'm like, no, I've seen your kids.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No. And watching that, I remember, quick story. My uncle was running a bowling alley, and the kids were in there in the video game machine room, pretty much trying to break the video games. And he went in there and told them to stop it. And, after basically having to raise his voice at them, they went and told their dad. Their dad came and confronted my uncle. The dad eventually pulled a knife on my uncle, basically like, my kids. Yeah, it was, my kids. You're calling my kids liars. My kids aren't liars. They would never do anything like that. And my uncle's pointing out that not only him, but others there have witnessed it. And, the guy was pretty much like, yeah, my kids would never do that. Shut up or else.
Right.
And I've seen that before, not so much the knife being pulled on, but, parents just not allowing somebody to say your kid was bad. It's my kid would never. Oh, he would never do that. She would never do that. And when you talk about, first of all, if you go to anybody to get parenting advice, you're always going to get bad advice because it's, what's
Right.
good for the goose is not good for the gander. And, when you talk about them going down the line and saying no spanking, no yelling, no timeout, my question becomes, what consequence then? How do you teach them a consequence for their action? Because it doesn't matter whether you're a kid or an adult or a teenager, whatever level in life, you have consequences for your actions. And if you're not taught that at a young age, you're in for a hell of a surprise as you get older, because it's exactly what's going to happen. You're going to get to a point where you're either going to get your ass kicked by somebody for saying the wrong thing because you didn't realize the consequence of your action. You're going to end up in legal trouble. I could go down the line of where you might have to suffer the consequences of your action. But that's what you're taking away. When you can't discipline your kid, when you're saying don't in any way discipline your kid, you're taking away the teaching of a consequence of an action. And that's really where it is. When you're trying to raise them in a libertarian household to question authority, it's very hard because you question authority except for mine, and so you can see how that might be a little confusing for kids. And it's the same thing. Like, we want them to be good at school. Our kids go to a charter school. If we had to send them to public school, then they'd get homeschooled. But again, the authority that we try to teach them to question is the government authority and the government telling you what to do. But that's a hard thing to teach a young kid to separate,
Right.
So yeah, in a libertarian household, that can be a fun exercise to have discipline and yet still want them to be independent thinkers that question authority. So, we have to work on that constantly. But, back to, I guess, our main point, which is divorce and all that. It's one thing to get divorced when you don't have kids. It's definitely another thing to get divorced when you do have kids. At that point, again, when the courts are dictating how often a parent gets to see it, I think that's a problem. In the case of my current wife and her ex, they did everything with lawyers, but no courts. So they signed agreements together and came to agreements. And a lot of respect to both of them because they co-parent great and they do share custody. It's 50-50 custody. And he really stepped up in that regard, even in being bitter about, the divorce, and focused on what's best for the kids. And now they, like I said, they co-parent great. The kids get to see their dad whenever they want. I mean, there's not just like, oh, well, this isn't your day, so too bad, so sad, and vice versa. If they're at their dad's and they start missing their mom, they're allowed to come home and see their mom. And this is as libertarian as you can get if you're going to get divorced with kids. Again, there was no judge telling them, no, it absolutely has to be this. They sat down with each lawyer just to make sure it was legal and nobody could screw them later, so to speak, which I'm glad, even that looks now in the past silly because they obviously came to a good agreement and neither one of them have any desire to do anything mean to the other one. Not everybody's like that, and I find that sad. I find that society, but I also think that the court system again allows the kids to be used as a weapon from one side, one parent or the other, depending on who has the power in that case when they go see the judge. And that is detrimental all around when you talk about divorce and what the kids go through.
Well, yeah, especially, I remember being a weaponized kid, because my father had a vendetta against my mom, and he knew that going after us would be one of the best ways, to get back at her. And that was a classic example of some really interesting lawyering because basically he took us down to the court where the original divorce was filed. We were not told what was going on. They made sure that we were never in the courtroom. And the reason why was because they were about to say a bunch of stuff that was totally false. And their hope was that they could get emergency temporary custody, and that when the judge evaluated the fact that my father had a lot more money than my mother, that would lead to us just finally just being placed with him. And so they said crazy stuff like that my mom had offered us cocaine or something like that. Just really crazy false stuff. Yeah. And that's why they were careful to be sure we were never in the room because they just flagrantly lied. And it was an example, here's another perfect way of going about this, right? So because we played a lot of street football, right? When my dad showed up to pick us up that day, he said he was taking us to the dentist because he had dental, insurance for us. We had been playing street football all day, right? So my brother and I were filthy and sweaty and and so so my mom said, "Do you want to have them change?" And he said, No, that's okay. I've got clothes for them to change into, right? So guess what was passed around as evidence at the courtroom?
Your dirty clothes.
Right. And they said that's just how we always dress, right? So stuff like that goes on in family court all the time. And lawyers will represent people who do things like this on a regular basis. That's just my ex's lawyer was fully aware of the things that were going on. There's no way that he wasn't. He just didn't care, And that's one of the things that also just led to me to be like, well, if we're going to have the state involved in this, for one thing, it almost feels to me like lawyers either need to be public servants or they need to go away, one or the other. Because if you can't afford one, you're at a serious disadvantage. Really the only reason I came out as well as I did is because she was so terrible that it was hard to even keep her in the picture for that reason, aside from the gender bias we've already discussed. But for the average guy who doesn't have anything, I remember, here's a great example. My brother, in his divorce, the way that the custody was decided, it was that they got joint custody, but then they decided how much child support was going to be paid based upon who made more money. So he had his kids through the 5 days of the week for school and was still paying child support to her. And to make sure that she didn't pay as much child support, she just never worked. So, that was the setup that he got stuck with because he didn't have a lawyer and she did.
Right. I mean, that's the state of Pennsylvania. You're almost, as a guy with a job, are almost always going to pay child support. My brother has to and still does because he went out and had kids again, even after his first set of kids, his OGs. Were old enough to no longer they turned 18. And then right before that, he had another 2 kids with another woman. And so he's back to paying child support. But, also in terms of that, in the state of Pennsylvania, they have a chart. And the person, if it's not a judge, if you're just doing, I guess they call it an advocate, or I forget the other word for it. But, you go in there and they sit down to avoid crowding the judges with all this. They basically sit down and say, okay, you make $50,000 a year. So, and you have this many kids. So sliding over a number of kids with your income, you pay $1,200 a month in child support. Okay. Now get this. He doesn't like his job. He's not happy with his boss, wants to get a new job. New employer says, we'll hire you, but it's $10,000 pay cut. So now instead of $50,000 a year, it's $40,000. He goes back to the courts. The courts say, well, you're capable of $50,000 a year because you showed that, because you already made that. So you're still paying child support at $50,000 a year, even though your new job is only $40,000 a year.
Yeah, and that kind of stuff is definitely going to make the real libertarian out of people when it comes to, rethinking how they feel about the courts being involved. You
Well, you would
know,
think.
yeah, it's a question of like, you've also got to be able to find private arbitration, and there are people who do that, right?
Yes.
But ideally, what I would tell young people, and I still do, I'm just going to be like blunt about it. I never had intercourse with a woman that I didn't think I could have kids with. When it came to my ex-wife, to be somewhat fair to myself, she was later a diagnosed sociopath. So she was very good at misrepresenting herself. But in general, the majority of the sexual partners I had over my entire life were people that we even had these conversations. And I think you should, right? People tend to forget the fact that the purpose of intercourse, while it is enjoyable, is reproduction, right? And so you should probably think to yourself, well, before I engage in this recreation that could lead to that, is this the kind of person I would want to procreate with, right? Like, and could we raise somebody together? And in some cases, that could just be a good friend, right? Who's a female, or whatever your persuasion is, if you're going to produce a child anyway, right? Who well, yeah, I get along really well with them. If we had a co-parent, it would be pretty cool, right? The funny thing is there might be people who are friends of yours that could co-parent with you better than you're probably choosing to be your boyfriend or girlfriend. That's entirely possible, right? But that's another, it comes back to what I said earlier about the way relationships work nowadays. It's you go back and you think to the old ways, right? The old ways that things were done, and you don't want to go back to them, but you do understand them, right? You start to get, okay, well, I don't really agree with this approach. For example, I don't think my wife should be an extension of my property. I don't think my daughter should be the property of her. You definitely don't want that kind of stuff back, but you begin
Right.
to understand why people took their time before they got married. You begin to understand why, people had certain expectations of what marriage would be, right? And we don't have that anymore. Marriage just seems to be a circumstance in which we involve the state in our lives to be sure that we can adjudicate our inevitable divorce. That's what it really feels like at this point.
Yeah, I think I agree. And, when you get down to it, again, as I stated earlier, we went from one group, the females not having the rights, to all of a sudden, well, let's make sure they have rights. So then it went to an extreme. It wasn't equal rights. And I guess if you're going to do this in a libertarian mindset, then you have to understand what equal rights are. And it's amazing because we have a lot of talk these days about abortion. And, right now, particularly the Democrats on social media are saying, if you're a man, then shut up. You have no say in this.
Right.
It's all about the woman, about the woman's rights. And it doesn't matter if you respond back and say, what about the kids' rights? It doesn't matter. It's about the woman's right. And you're a man, you can't give birth, so shut up. And then, so interesting enough, the extremes are now that women can get pregnant and not even have to tell the man. There's no law. There's nothing that says he has to tell the man that she's carrying his baby. Okay.
Right.
In almost all states, the woman can knowingly list the wrong father on the birth certificate, so deceive him. And in many states, the wrong man then becomes the child's legal father forever. Okay.
Right.
Now, in some terms, this would be, yeah, go ahead, baby. I'll pretend like I'm the legal father, and your ex can just get screwed. Who cares? But that's essentially kidnapping in terms of that.
Sure.
Um, you know, basically the kid lost his real father with no due process, and there's little to no recourse to the woman for doing something like that, for wrongfully listing a name or not telling the father that he has a kid. Um, and then law doesn't just allow it, it creates these opportunities. And so again, as we talk about moving towards libertarianism and everything, libertarianism is about the equal rights, and there's nothing equal about that. When you're being told shut up, you have no say in abortion, and you have no say in really anything when it comes to the child, almost until you get an attorney and fight for it after it's born and after it's proven that it's yours. If you can do that and if you know about it, that's just crazy to me. And of course, the argument is, well, there's some bad men out there. I know when my wife went to go get the ultrasound with our first kid, we went to I forget what it's called, but it's basically one of those free places to go do it. And anyway, I forget the name of it. They took her aside. They had asked me to wait out in the room, and basically the questioning was around, does he beat you? Is he abusive? Are you okay? Are you safe in this relationship? Do you need us to do anything? Like, do you need us to tell him you had a miscarriage? Even if you didn't, things like that. And of course she was like, no, I want him in the room for this whole process. He's a great guy. But I mean, it's a presumption that we're just automatically bad. And therefore they're allowed to do that with the kids. They're allowed to, lie to us about pregnancy, lie to us about the name on the birth certificate, things like that. There's no equality there, is my point. And this again comes down to when you let government involved in all this. So, the solution is a tough one when it comes to fighting over family and kids, because it's different than fighting over who keeps the car or the house. It's material possession compared to a life. But the government doesn't do anything to make it easy for anybody. But I would say particularly, and the stats shows this, it's completely stacked against men.
Right. And, and I hope that, again, like I said earlier, that, men who take this into account, that doesn't mean that there aren't still good women out there, and that you do need to be careful though. And that's, like people talk about MGTOW, men going their own way, and the attitude about it is just, as people have pointed out, they've done the cost benefit analysis and they've just decided they're not going to do it anymore. And this situation is a big part of it. And that was one of the things that I noticed, because you were talking about, like we once again talked about the old ways, was that the family court seems to have the old fashioned ideals, but women are allowed to kind of double dip on this, right? So is in they get to be the strong, independent, professional person, but then they also get to decide that they're the damsel in distress whenever they want, right? Mm-hmm. And that's not equality either, right? If you're going to keep the privileges that were offered to the traditional old school patriarchal family, because that's basically what they were in, say, the 50s, right? Then at that point, if this is no longer your role, and then the protections that were afforded to you, things like alimony, things like ridiculous, ways of calculating child support, things like that, all need to also be gone. That's otherwise, like you said earlier, there is no true equality. And you could definitely see them play both sides of the fence if they're allowed to do so. There were bad men. I mean, we also have to acknowledge that, right? That the reason alimony exists is because, especially during the time period when it was very hard for women to work, alimony existed because men might have 3 kids with a woman and then go meet a younger woman and then just leave, right? And then she was somehow supposed to fend for the family, even though she wasn't equal in the workforce. She usually wasn't going to have any way to take care of her kids, and he's just decided to take off, right? So that was a real problem. I'm not going to say that wasn't a problem, right?
But is it a real problem? I mean, statistically, though, how often did that happen? I mean, that would be my question. It's like everything else. We tend to try to do stuff based on 1% of a population. You know, like it happened 1% of the time, so we have to do something about this.
Well, right. No, I know what you're saying. I think what I was going to try to get at, though, is that now we have a situation where instead of one gender doing that, both of them are, right? And that creates just this terrible minefield of a situation, especially for people who want to have kids, right? My ex-wife was allowed to do those very things. She ran off for a while with somebody, tried to come back into the house, forced her way back into the family. There were no penalties for that, right? She was allowed to do all of that stuff. And the courts protected her from everything that she did wrong, all in the name of the understanding that supposedly, as the woman, she is traditionally going to be, positioned as the one who is disadvantaged in the situation, no matter what she did, right? What I'm getting at, though, is just to suggest that if there's going to be true equality, if they're actually going to be true, then all of these old-fashioned ideas that they also still seem to want to keep, that's the thing. You don't usually see third-wave feminists talking too heavily about the fact that they are fully aware of the fact that, yes, they do have an advantage in family court. It's not one of their priorities to deal with this problem, right? And if they do, they just find a way to blame it on patriarchy, like we mentioned earlier, right? But that's not their priority. That's one of the reasons why Fresco pointed out that he was not for any kind of what I would call specific group grievance activism, which is like you're just being an advocate for one group, is inevitably you end up in a situation where not only do you become what you chose to oppose, but you then start to support things that don't really lead to you being treated fairly anymore. They lead to you be treated, you gaining your own privilege. Does that make sense?
Yeah. When I was sitting here reading the chat, and King Brandon said he cared about that 1%, which I was going to say, it's not that we don't care about the 1%, but I think he made the next point, which is society ought to be built on the ideal of protecting everyone individually rather than protecting everyone as a group. I think that was what I was going to say. As far as the percentage goes, you don't just blanket and say, now every man has to pay alimony. You take it on a case-to-case basis. You don't say, well, 1% of the men do this, so all men now have to do that. That was my point I was trying to make. And, another interesting thing here in the state of Pennsylvania, I know every state works it differently. The child, when a judge orders the courts order the child support payments, it comes out, it's basically taken out of your paycheck. So it's not relying on waiting for the man to write a check to the ex, right, or the woman, if that's actually the case. But in this case, we're talking about fathers and fathers' rights. So my friend has to deal with this all the time. The employer basically takes the money out of his check, and it's supposed to go to this government agency, and this government agency issues my friend's ex-wife the child support check. Well, when his employer is behind on it and doesn't do it, they still don't write her a check. She has to call my friend and say, hey, your boss didn't pay the child support this week or this month, and so they're not paying me. Then he has to walk into his boss and say, well, you escrowed it. My check stub shows you didn't give me the money, so why didn't you send it off to the agency? And his boss is like, oh, I forgot. And this is, happens quite frequently. So the state's facilitating it, but if the employer doesn't pay it, send the money into the state doesn't send it to the woman. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. And, and that would be an example of the state screwing something up. What I'd be curious about then is, though, being late on child support is something that can come into custody and parenting time and all kinds of stuff like that too. They used to arrest them for it. I don't think they really do that anymore. But
well, they can't arrest my friend for it because he's not the one getting paid. If the money was going to him and he was required to pay her, then that would be the case. But Pennsylvania tried to take that away to avoid arresting the men and putting them in jail and making them lose their jobs and making life even harder for both parties, right? So they started escrowing it out of the paycheck. Now, one of two things happen. Either you keep your job and you let it happen, or what some men have done, particularly in the state, is go get jobs at construction companies, handyman jobs where they can get paid under the table and no paycheck. And that's their way of trying to get out of child support. So if they don't have a W-2, a paycheck to have the money escrowed out to get paid cash, oops, now they're, the person's really screwed. But my point is that we have all this welfare, all the state welfare, until it comes to that. And then all of a sudden they tell the mother, well, sorry, the employer didn't send the money in, so you'll have to call them.
Right. Well, and I've seen that also done from the other side. Like my ex-wife sometimes would work as a waitress because then she just would not claim her tips You
Right.
know, so then the child support's coming out of that, what, $2.15 an hour they make or whatever. You know, there's all kinds of stuff like that, and it's unfortunate in the long run that, you know, that it gets handled that way. I think that the question would then be, you know, if you were going to try to handle this in, say, an anarchist world, then what? Like,
Well, you first you start with the presumption of joint custody. Okay. Um, if two people can't come to terms on what days that you have the kids, then you go get an arbitrator. You agree to that because the final steps would be having to deal with some, you know, government force. Because one, I mean, it's impossible in our lives right now to live in a true anarchist society. People don't want that. But if you were to create a village or something with that, then everything starts with equality, presumption of equality. So there's the presumption of joint custody. You
right?
guys work it out. You decide what days, how the 50-50 is going to work. Are you going to do, five, 5, 2, and 5, meaning you get them Monday through Friday, then she gets them for the weekend, and then you switch and, she gets them Monday through Friday and you get them for the weekend. So it's like a 5-7-5 or something. I forget how it's calculated or termed, but you understand what I'm saying.
Sure.
My wife right now, her arrangement with with her ex is that the Monday and Tuesdays are his days, and then every other weekend as well. So the way it works, and I'm still explaining that wrong, but he gets 50% of the time. They just have it worked out on set days on that, and they worked it out together. So that would be the thing. So first of all, you have a presumption of joint custody. Second of all, you have again, you handle stuff on an individual case. So if this was a case of husband worked, or it doesn't matter, one spouse worked and the other didn't, we'll say it that way. So it's not husband or wife worked, it's one spouse worked and the other didn't. Now you have a case of making child support, but you can still work it out. So let's say, for example, both parties say, well, I don't really want my kids to go to a daycare. Well, great, because if I have to go get a job, then the kids have to go to daycare. So what you were going to spend in daycare now can be child support. So you can have ways to amicably work this out. The point you're trying to make is if you can't, then it goes to first level, an arbitrator, somebody to help work that out and bring some common sense into it in a safe environment. Next, it would go to legal, where two attorneys say, well, here's, laws, and if you don't do this, then you have to face these laws, which in the case of men, this is going to be stacked against you. So before you go to court, you might want to consider cooperating now. If we could get the states and the government to have more equality, that would kind of balance itself out there. But I think everything starts with the individual case, and everybody starting with one, you're getting 50-50 custody of the kid. If there's no kid involved, I think that makes things much easier in terms of divorce. You're splitting up assets at that point. And that becomes, everybody's got their arguments for it, and I disagree with most of them. And I'll give you an example. My wife was told that she could get a lot from her ex. She could get half of his pension. Well, my point was, he earned the pension. Why would you be able to get half of it? It's not yours. Sure. Other people say, well, you raised the kids, you're the one who stayed at home, so you deserve half of that. We know people who, went and took half of their ex's pension. I think that's completely wrong that the government allows that. I think once you earn something like that, you're working to put the money in your 401k, your pension, you keep that kind of thing. If you're just talking about how the person can live every day, again, if you were a stay-at-home wife, but you had no kids, you can go get a job after a divorce. I don't think I owe you anything. I'm sorry,
Right.
That's the way it is. If kids are involved, then if you're a good person, you're obviously going to figure out the best way to make it work so the kids are happy and feel like they've got a good environment. If you're not a good person, if this is about vendetta, that's where you need this arbitrator to come in and bring some cool heads down and say, let's get rid of these vendetta talks and go with what reality is.
Well, and that would have to also just imply that the professional mediator would have to have a very different attitude than the lawyers do. That's for sure. Because another aspect of this that I noticed was that these people get paid based on how long things take, right? So a lawyer has an incentive to talk somebody into, well, why don't you try to get half his pension? Why don't you try to get full custody? Why don't you try to get you should get the house. You should definitely get the house. And in the long run, they're not paid by success. I mean, eventually a lawyer will get a bad reputation, right? But in the long run, they get paid by the hour. So it's really not in their best interest if you figure things out quickly, not from the lawyer's perspective anyway, right? And so you got to remember that when you're dealing with these people. And there was a point at which, for example, I finally got my ex-wife to understand. I was like, you do realize that this guy kind of has an incentive to tell you to do this, to file motions, to constantly be back in court. And she's like, yeah, I'm starting to get that, because eventually, even though she was very confrontational, she was getting sick of it too, because it went on for a long time, and it was just a matter of like, you got to remember that when you're dealing with these family lawyers. And there are a lot of people that talk about this. Like, if you're having a problem in your relationship and the first thing you do is go talk to a family lawyer, they're going to try to talk you into getting a divorce, and this happens all the time, right? They're going to be like, well, hey, if you're having problems now, you should probably already be looking into this. You definitely want to be the one to file first, and you want to do this and you want to do that, and like,
we got to eliminate this file first thing where whoever files first has the advantage. I mean, that's something that's got to be eliminated in all states. I mean, again, you got to get to a level, and people have to demand this, and we don't. I mean, we've talked about this before. There's very little focus on anything but the presidential elections. People don't focus on who local judges are, local sheriffs, local anything, as much as they do the stuff that's really inconsequential to them, like a president being elected. And therefore, it makes it so hard to fight the fight and to get to this equality, because most people don't want to. It's a common put their hands in the air and say, well, what can I do? Nobody's telling them what can be done. Nobody has any advice on what can be done. It's all just accepted and move on type deal. And that includes this racket of the attorneys. You would think that there would be some service that came, and they are out there. They're just not popular. Most people know to attorney up and go, because, you're told if you don't get an attorney and he does or she does, you're screwed.
Right. And I think that it's also important that people recognize that inevitably there are going to be dirty tactics that these people are going to push for, because again, the lawyer, they do want to win, right? That looks good for them, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's good for the kids. It doesn't necessarily mean it's even good for the people involved, like what the outcomes really are. And like, one of the things you said about that actually struck a chord with me, and I forgot to mention it, was that when you said that, you're not going to dictate to me when I talk to my kids, when you're referencing a judge or whatever, that was one of the most frustrating things of the whole situation, was that these are people who don't even freaking know you, right? Like, you've talked to me for 20 minutes and then you're going to tell me where my kids are going, right? Like, are you kidding me? That was actually another point Jacques Fresco used to say, was that he felt that judges of today would be considered criminals of tomorrow. And when I asked him to elaborate, he said that, so you have these people wielding enormous power over your life and they have no idea who you are. It's like, they don't know you. They don't know your situation. And he was referring mostly to criminal cases, but it is definitely true during family cases, right? And then they're usually going by guidelines. They're just kind of following the book, so to speak. And that's how you end up with stuff like, well, they belong with the father, they belong with the mother, they belong in joint custody, this, or that. And that becomes more important than any kind of extenuating circumstance. And it was also very frustrating because, especially with somebody like my ex-wife, she was the kind of personality that it would take you a while to really figure her out, right? Like, I remember once, for example, I had a roommate that when she got there, she was kind of put off by the way the relationship was going. She started talking to the godfather of my kids about it, because it was she was his cousin. And he's like, man, she was like, you need to come talk to Neil about what's going on in this relationship. I don't think he's being very nice, blah, 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 blah. And the guy starts laughing at her, and she's like, this isn't funny. He's like, look, I lived with them for 3 years. I'll tell you what, you live there for 3 months. And if you still think that he's the problem, give me a call. Right. And then so she calls him back and goes, holy crap, this bitch is crazy. I'm sorry I tried to involve you in this. The point is that no judge was ever going to get that information. They were never going to grasp that. In what? The 30-minute or so hearings where she's permitted to just put on a show, whether it's to cry on demand or to have her lawyer, just, come up with blustering stories that just weren't true, and they do too. They just straight up lie, because it isn't about what's true. It's about what you can quote unquote prove in court. That's what they say about criminal cases. In family cases, it's what can you convince them is true, right? And if that person has any kind of biases, because that's another really powerful point that you pointed out, is that we tend to forget that so many people involved in this are elected, right? Nobody pays any attention to the judge elections. You
Right.
don't know who the hell you're voting for, right?
Yeah, and if you're just pulling a ticket, all Republican or all Democrat ticket, because that's what you do, you're getting what you deserve, I would say.
Well, especially like, well, let's say that you are voting Republican and you're voting Republican out of habit because you're a Republican, and then you don't realize, man, I just voted for a super ultra patriarchal Christian, and now he's presiding over my case, and he's going to give custody to my ex-wife without any questions asked, right? There's no accountability to those positions either. You know, in fact, frequently they run without anybody running against them, right? Just like sheriffs. You know, we should do a whole show about sheriffs at some point.
I would love to. I think we did one back in like the 2009, 10-ish, but I'd love to revisit it.
Yeah, the constitutional power of the sheriff is something that I wish that, you know, if you're really concerned about how policing is done in your area, maybe, I don't know, get involved in the election for the person who's in charge of that, who is elected and therefore accountable to the people, who was that way by design.
Right.
And the same thing is true of all these judges, right? But does anybody ever bother? And don't get me wrong, I'm being a mild hypocrite. I don't look into it either, right? You know, but I should. So should everyone else. Before you cast your ballot for anybody, you should be looking them up. What's their case history, right? Because that's what the lawyers have to do. They have to decide how they're going to accomplish things based on what judge was appointed, right? You know, and so
and we got to get past, I mean, every politician, your state legislators all the way up to Congress that goes all the way to DC, it's all this, I don't want to use the word talking points, but I guess there's no better word, but it's all these, you know, we're going to create new jobs, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and nothing substantial. Like they don't even talk about corrupt judges and things like that. You know, it's always, I'm going to be tough on crime. So you assume it has nothing to do with corrupt judges. It has everything to do with citizens out there. I'm going to be, you know, I'm going to create jobs. And we don't sit down. And again, as you said, we're almost all guilty of this, hypocritical in a way, because we don't sit down and talk to our state legislators and say, look, there's a problem in these areas, like in divorce courts. And some of these problems stem from these judges who have no recourse. Can we create a system where judges can be ousted or get recourse for these bad decisions? Look at the stats. The stats show that, you know, kids need to have both parents in their lives. If you have a judge who's constantly one-sided, that judge needs to go. What can you and your state legislators do to fix that problem and correct it? And yeah, I mean, I don't even vote anymore because I'm so fed up with politics and politicians that I don't even get involved in that side. And I know people like to say, well, if you don't vote, you don't have a say. And it's like, yeah, well, if you do vote, you still don't have a say. So don't give me that shit.
Right. Yeah. And we can actually revisit that topic now that you're allowed to discuss that on YouTube again, by the way. I had gotten dinged for that for over, I was taken off for a week for discussing anomalies during the Democratic primary. I wasn't even talking about Trump, right? And they dinged me for a week for talking about that. So we can get back into that. I'll probably try to bring on Clint Curtis again, literally the man who was asked by, at the time, it was the Republican Party asking him to write software to rig voting machines. We'll be discussing that again on a future episode for sure. But as far as like, before we were done for the day on this topic, I did also want to take an opportunity because it's related, because to discuss this, which is restraining orders. And the reason that this is important is that people need to understand the reality of these situations. And this is an excellent article. I'm not going to try to read the whole thing, but I will make it available in the description. It's also like, I don't know what it is about the website, but it's formatted weird. So half of it is cut off and there's no slider for me to move it around. But anyway, the guy who wrote this article did a very good job in breaking down what the deal is with restraining orders. And he also mentioned what their role typically is in a divorce. And he calls it like a quickie divorce, because you can go make a claim, get yourself a restraining order, and for 90 days, you could have full access to the house, full access to the kids, and, you know, and your ex out of your life instantly. And the burden of proof is, well, nothing. And it's all done ex parte. You're not invited, right? Now you can file to change that, but as in you can file to have a restraining order overturned. But in the time that you're trying to do all of that, you're out of the house with nothing but the clothes on your back, right? This article goes into great detail about how judges are instructed to give these things. And it's important that people to know how this works also, because there's a stigma that gets assigned to you just for ever having had one of these on you, even though it really just amounts to the fact that somebody went to a court and said things. You were not there to defend yourself. They could literally say anything. And the first example, the reason that there's a picture of David Letterman here is that the guy starts the article off by pointing out that a woman got a restraining order on David Letterman and he didn't even know who she was. She was deluded herself into believing that he was communicating with her and harassing her through coded messages during his show. I wish I was making that up. But he had a restraining order against him, right? And that's because of the fact that they generally, the guidance is, well, if a woman comes to you and says a man is making you feel unsafe, then you just need to give them this, right? And that's before we even get into the next layer of it, which is that this also gets your guns taken from you. No due process. You're not allowed to have guns if one of these are on you. Go ahead, Brian. I know you're just chomping at the bit.
I was just thinking, I mean, this happened to poor Letterman, but you would think it would have happened to Bill O'Reilly much more often than Letterman.
Right.
You could see that, like watching his show, you'd be like, oh my God, is this guy attacking me?
With that big finger he would stick in your face. I was like, I will break your finger on live television if you do that to me.
Calling everybody who disagrees with his position a pinhead. Like, this guy's attacking me.
Right. Yep.
I need a restraining order against Bill O'Reilly.
Right.
But anyway,
but still, it comes down to the fact that this is a ex parte, has a normal amount of ex parte, meaning you're not invited. We get to talk about you behind your back, has enormous power over your life. Right. And fortunately enough, depending on how the police decide to enforce it is going to have an impact on it, although it's officially not supposed to, but in the end of the day, it can literally happen. Your ex-wife or husband, I guess, as the case may be, could go to court, claim that you are beating them up, convince the judge. The judge will then give them this order, and then the police will show up, issue you the order, throw you out of the house, take all of your guns. And then the other person gets the kids, because they can, of course, be listed in the restraining order as victims of violence. And the other major part of this, that there's the big, huge problem here, because people are like, well, yeah, I'm sure people can make false claims, but what happens? Nothing. There are no penalties for doing this wrong. There are no penalties for lying about this. When it comes to Child Protective Services, it's the same basic concept. There is technically a penalty in place if somebody files a false Child Protective Services claim against you. But it's literally only ever handled if the protective service people get a bee in their bonnet about you and decide to do something about it. So that's the reason why I had a stack of false, Child Protective Services claims to use against my ex-wife in court. But there were no penalties against her for filing all of those false claims. So this is something I just wanted people to be aware of, and it's relevant only because they're frequently used in divorce. They're frequently brought up in divorce. And there's really no burden of proof.
Right. Or due process anyway.
Right, exactly. And that's why they're dangerous. I do still think that we should be able to have circumstances where I just don't want to interact with somebody anymore and I want them to leave me alone. I'm not saying that there isn't. The question is what else comes with that, right? And if it's going to be, well, now they're going to take all my firearms, if it's going to be that they can throw me out of my house, if it's going to be that they can prevent me from seeing my children, because again, if you got a restraining order and they include your children in the restraining order, you don't get to talk to your kids, right? And so all of that could be done with no due process and no burden of proof.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, from the time I was a teenager and kind of understood and learned about restraining orders, I thought that was the most ridiculous thing we could ever come up with in this society. I've never heard a really good argument for them. And the fact that they're still there and can still be used that way. I mean, you look at this David Letterman thing and the fact that the judge approved it. That says a lot, particularly about judges. Like, again, we treat like going to a judge and they're ruling like almost like they're God. Like, well, the judge said this, and it's like, yeah, well, the judge is apparently an idiot. Look at this, you know. I mean, come on, that's as ridiculous as you can get. Obviously, Letterman had money and everything, was able to get this taken care of, but so it didn't really destroy his life in any way. But you can imagine what this could do to other people. You know, it could just be detrimental to them, their job, their career, anything, when it comes to that. And again, I have found no good argument for restraining orders. The state of Pennsylvania, where I live, they're not actually called restraining orders. There's 3 different orders. There's a PFA, which is protection from abuse. There's an SVPO, which is protection from sexual violence order. And then there's a PFI, which is protection from intimidation order. Now, the other thing that really cracks me up about all this is to think that some piece of paper that a judge puts out is going to stop somebody. You get a restraining order against me, it's kind of ridiculous because I had no desire to go and hurt anybody anyway. And all you're doing is, like you said, taking some things away from me and possibly turning me into a criminal where I'd likewise never be one.
Right.
On the other hand, if I am a bad person and my desire is to hurt you, what piece of paper is going to stop that?
Right. And that's
I mean,
why,
you
yeah,
know-
well, that's a perfect example. I keep talking about this because I had to deal with the people who were acting like the Punisher was on the side of criminals or whatever. And I was like, well, let me give you an example of what would happen in the event. And I promise this is relevant. That the cop, okay. So basically, Jacob Blake was the guy who got shot in Kenosha. And his ex, who was raped by him, there was an active warrant for him and a restraining order. Right. And he was still there. It did get the cops to show up, but it doesn't change the fact that it didn't stop him from being there. In the end, I think that, the reality is that if I was in that situation, it was happening to my daughter, the cops would be the least of his worries. But it also has to do with the fact that you got to just be able to put women in a position where they can protect themselves. Because as you pointed out, this piece of paper alone is not going to do the trick. Right.
Well, it's not bulletproof,
Right. It's definitely not bulletproof, and I still think that, again, there could be a place for something like that. If you don't want anybody to be harassing you or whatever, there has to be a recourse for something like that. But
Right.
as you pointed out, the only reason, and that's one of the things that's a point in this article, is that David Letterman had the benefit of having a TV show where he could mock the judge that approved of this. Right. The average citizen would not have that. Right. The average citizen would not have the benefit of being in a position where he could get public outcry to get something like this overturned. And it's still something that's on his record till the day he dies, and that's basically one of the reasons why I looked at this and I felt that we did something that I do feel that we do need to do something to stop domestic violence. We need to stop stalking. Those are all real problems.
Well,
right?
I mean, that's the thing about the society. We always say we have to do stuff to stop this. We have to stop racism. We have to stop domestic violence. You can't stop this stuff.
Right.
You can't. I mean, haters are going to hate. Violent people are going to be violent. It's already obviously a crime to murder somebody. It's a crime to physically assault somebody. Now, to say that these grown adults who go in and beat the living shit out of somebody, whether it be their spouse or their spouse's new boyfriend or whatever, to say that they didn't know they would get in trouble for it, that's kind of bullshit. They don't care,
Right.
And so you can't. This is the same argument we have with politicians about the gun laws. What are you going to write on a piece of paper that's going to stop a bad person from going and doing a bad thing? You can't. And yeah, do we want to stop domestic abuse? Do we want to stop sex crimes? Do we want to stop racism? Of course we do. If you're any kind of person, not even a libertarian, if you just got any kind of, humanity in you, you don't want those things to happen. But again, to think that all you can do is go to the government and they can either sign a piece of paper in terms of restraining order or in terms of a law, and all of a sudden it will be fixed and it will end. There's no way. I mean, it's just not going to happen. Haters are going to hate. Violent people are going to do violent things. Can you limit them? sure, you can limit them. I mean, you focused on one thing you said there, where people have to have a right to personally protect themselves. So we got to make sure that stand your ground laws, which shouldn't even be laws. I mean, the fact that you have to read about it where the state gives you permission to stand your ground and defend yourself and say, well, if you do that, we won't punish you. Well, you shouldn't have even brought that up. If I defend myself, yeah, of course you shouldn't be punishing me. We shouldn't even be having this conversation. The states without stand your ground laws, I mean, they need to go. They need to go right away. Meaning if this state says, hey, you know, somebody's attacking you and you shoot them, you can still get in trouble for shooting them. I mean, that's very bad. And that sets a situation up where criminals are like, thank you very much.
Right. And I do think that we need to have a better relationship with our own personal responsibility when it comes to self-defense. There's a reason that my kids were raised into boxing and wrestling and martial arts. There's a reason why my daughter's going to be learning how to use firearms. You know, there's a reason why, you know, these things happen. And I think that just kind of needs to be understood. You know, it's not that I would say, you know, at least if we're going to have a state, obviously, it's not that I don't think that the state doesn't have some role to play. That much is certain. One of the problems that you frequently see, for example, in the current abolish the police crowd that come from the ironically anarcho-communist point of view, is that, and not a legitimate anarcho-communist point of view, I might add. The older anarcho-communists think these people are crazy, but you know, they seem to think that we could just turn off the police and the state altogether, and that everybody can just arm themselves, and that will be enough. The problem is that you know, the reason that the state exists in of itself right now is to try to solve a certain problem. Are there better stateless ways to solve those problems? I'm totally open to that possibility, but a lot of them are going to have to come from the way that society's values themselves are, right? Whether it's embracing the non-aggression principle or, you know, whatever it is that has to change. In the meantime, just because we've eliminated the state's monopoly on force doesn't mean that the ability to gain a monopoly on force automatically goes away on its own. So you can't depend on cops to keep you safe. That doesn't mean I think we should get rid of them yet, right? And at the same time, it also does mean, however, that you should be, even if you are a statist, you should be in a position where you are reasonably capable of defending yourself, you know, in the circumstances in which you find yourself. And people shouldn't be looked down on for seeking the ability to do that, right? It should just be understood. Of course, you need to be able to protect yourself. And that's why, you know, like when we talked about during the gun control show, I pointed out that I've been watching a lot of Westerns lately. And I thought about it when I was watching one the other day. I was like, man, I wonder how far a mass shooter would get in your average Western town, right? Probably about 10 steps.
Yeah, they don't really exist unless that town had a rule against guns inside the town, like disarmament when you enter the town. Otherwise, they didn't really exist. You know, trying to bring this back to what the show is about and back
Sure.
to the restraining orders and stuff. You know, again, we're talking about, instead of a piece of paper that actually protects people, it's used as a weapon against somebody. And that was your original point with bringing it up in terms of on a show with divorce, that's one of the advice that people are given from an attorney. You know, go get a restraining order against this person. It could help your cause in the divorce court. So again, it's not used as a protection device. It's used as a weapon. Quite the opposite of what it's intended for, I would say.
For sure. I had a poll up and it was about, are you married, divorced, single, never married, or in a long-term relationship? Concluding the poll, now that we're almost done, the majority of the people listening today, 66%, were single, never married. 23% of them were currently married. 4% of them were divorced. And 4% of them were in a long-term relationship.
Right.
So,
well, and I voted on the long-term relationship, and I did that because my wife and I are never going to go to the government and get a marriage license. And we do hear from people, well, don't you want the benefits of being married, the tax benefits or the insurance or the blah, blah, blah? No, I don't care to go have the government license my relationship and then tell me I can get some benefit from it. I've lived my life without these quote unquote benefits from that, and I can continue to live my life that way. our love is and our commitment is ceremonial in terms of marriage, in terms of being together forever. Again, a marriage license doesn't even guarantee that. So what is the point of paying the money and getting this license only to have to go get the government's permission to separate afterwards? Now, again, I'm glad I'm in a happy, healthy relationship, and this isn't a worry for me. We do have kids together. And so, of course, if we were to ever separate, we would have to work that out. But given her past and the way she's worked it out with her previous ex, I'm confident that I'm with the right person and that we can work this out again without the state, which as a libertarian, that's exactly how I prefer it, to work it out without the state. So, I voted as long-term relationship because I do plan on staying with her until the death do us part aspect of it. But I do call her my wife, and I do say to everybody, this is my wife, when I introduce her and everything like that. But you'll never find that we actually have a marriage license. You won't be able to go to the courthouse, and you go down to the courthouse and be like, yeah, you said she's your wife, but I call bullshit because I don't see any marriage license on file.
Well, and that's one of the reasons I threw long-term relationship in there, is for people like, say, Goldie Hawn and Kurt Russell. They've been together their whole lives at this point.
Yeah, and I think some states have that common law marriage where I think, and I have to look it up, but I think Pennsylvania was like 12 years if you were together, living in the same household, then you're common law married.
Yeah, people have talked about that too. I do think that there's something to be said for that. And I look forward to seeing in the future. And as far as like, we're closing up a Father's Day show here. Can you think of anything that your father did that impacts you today, that makes you glad he was your father?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't have a good relationship with my father. Growing up, he was an alcoholic and everything, but there was, in all that, I can still think of good stuff that he did impact. And again, there was a lot of that. Even with the discipline that we talked about with the spanking, it was to teach us respect and to respect people and respect the things around us. We were also taught to work through our problems and to work it out, to deal with it. And I don't mean like just verbally, like, hey, Neil, you and I have a disagreement, let's sit down and talking about anything. Like, if I'm out working on something and I'm just running into a problem and can't figure out how to solve it, I was taught not to give up, to sit there and work through it, plow through it, drive through it, to solve the problem, to make sure I overcome it. And I think that was a great value to instill. And I hope I put that into my kids, because I hate, particularly modern day, seeing kids give up so easy on everything. Like, oh, it's so hard, I don't want to do it. Like, yeah, I mean, life isn't easy. Get over it, get through it. He took me out fishing, he took me out hunting, he took me out shooting guns. He did teach me how to deal with bullies and things like that. So amongst all the stuff that I don't like him for, there was a lot of good stuff that he did do. And thinking back on it as a father, he did obviously love us, despite his problems with alcohol and everything. He did love us, and he loved his kids. So yeah, I would say, the biggest thing that he put on us is, respecting the people around us. And, we would have got our ass beat for stuff like stealing. So, I look down really on people who steal. I hate stealing. I hate dishonesty, things like that. And so those things came particularly from my father, and that my mother wasn't part of that, but he was the one who would have whooped our ass for getting caught doing it. So, in that regard. But yeah, I think the problem solving, the working through it, the don't give up part of it is something I really appreciate taking out of it.
I think for me, unfortunately, I would say, and I've told people this before, but I'd say that I've been told a lot that I'm a good father. I think a large part of it is because my kids behave themselves, but it's not really going to be because of anything that he taught me. He was very unsupportive. So if anything, what ended up happening, ironically, was that he was so bad at it that it motivated me to be better at it.
I think I can make that point too. Yes.
Yeah. It's so like, it just, when my kids said they wanted to do sports, I remembered that when I was a kid, all I wanted to do was play football. I mean, I had dreams of the NFL. I mean, it was just being a kid, right? And he said that it would literally embarrass him if I ever played football because of how uncoordinated he felt I was and all of that. And, so when my kids said they wanted to do sports, I did allow them to decide, well, how important is this to you? Do you just want to play for fun, just club, or do you want to be good? So, of course, they said they wanted to be good. So then I dove headlong into what they wanted to do. And then the end result of that is that I ended up becoming a wrestling coach. I ended up loving the thing that they chose, but it was never a vicarious through the idea of like, there was a sport that I wanted to play that I didn't get to play. It was a matter of he didn't believe in me. Right. And I was like, I'm not going to be that. I'm going to be the opposite of that. And the rest of my ideas about raising kids actually more came from my mom. And like I said, she wasn't a huge user of corporal punishment, but there was a level of, okay, we're not going above this, right? But she also tried to encourage me by just having good conversations with me to help raise me in such a way that by the time I was 16, I didn't really have a curfew. And it wasn't because she didn't care. It's because she knew that I wasn't going to do drugs. I wasn't going to be getting girls pregnant. I wasn't going to be doing all of those things. And it wasn't because I was afraid of what would happen to me on the part of my parents. It was because I knew the consequences of those things. And it was because of the fact that she took the time to instill in me critical and analytical thinking skills. And that's, as a father, that's what I've tried to do. Because the reality is, if your kid is going to eat bleach, and the only thing that's stopping them from doing it is that they're concerned about being punished by you, then the likelihood is that they're still going to eat it the moment you're not around.
Right. I agree. My father was, I would say, taught me a lot of what not to do as a father.
Right.
For sure. Yeah. And the same thing with my growing up. My mom's rules were don't get arrested and go to jail, graduate high school, and don't get anybody pregnant, and don't die.
Right. Yeah. Don't die. And if you do, I'll ground you.
Something stupid is the translation. And I thought that was good. I worked a job. I paid for my own car, paid for my own clothes, so I figured she figured I had the right to be treated like an adult since I was acting like one. I'd get up in the morning to my alarm, get myself ready for school, get out of school, get myself dressed for a job and go to that job.
And so the next question that I would ask you is, can you think of any particularly rewarding moments for you as a dad?
For me as a dad, there's probably a lot of rewarding moments. The biggest thing is really the everyday, I work from home. And so I really get to see my kids a lot more than probably most people do. And the rewarding moments are those things that, you probably wouldn't get to see if you weren't home all day, just their goofiness, when they break out into that funny dance because a song came on while you were cooking lunch or something. Those moments really get me. But all my kids, I say, just have this, you can tell that they're brothers, but at the same time, they have like these each little parts of their personality that really get you. My oldest, he's very smart. He's just got this award-winning smile, and he's hard-headed, and parts of that I like, and parts of that frustrates me.
Where did you get that idea?
Yeah, exactly. My middle child is very independent. He doesn't really care to. He's not like begging for attention like normal kids are. Like he's fine going off and playing with his toys for an hour. So I have to remember to give him attention. I have to remember that I'm his father and go talk to him because he doesn't beg for it. Where my oldest wants my attention and comes and will interrupt me just to get it, things like that. My middle child is like, whatever, I'm playing. And so I have to remember to go be a father and talk to him. My youngest is 2 years old or about to turn 2. And he's just got everything that age has, it's the funny ways he says words, the funny movements that he does because he's still a little clumsy with things. Those little things just make you smile. And when they're all lined up together and you can see the relationship, and particularly when they're just wrestling around and being boys and being brothers, that really, a lot of that reminds me of my brother and I as kids, and it really just makes me smile to watch them, just laugh and wrestle and play around. And so, I don't say there's one particular moment aside from their birth that really stands out to me. It's just that everyday thing that I love about them.
So I think if I had to break it down to a few key points, aside from their athletic achievements, my daughter was a national champion in wrestling. My son has defeated national champions. I just hadn't taken him to any national tournaments himself. That stuff is actually kind of on the easy end. I'd say that I know one moment in particular, I was at this corner store that's like was right next to where our apartment building was. And the woman behind the counter, she was like, I just have to tell you, your son is always so polite and nice. And, I always know that he's doing the right thing, et cetera. It was like, it was kind of taken aback because this is a compliment from somebody that, she's not a regular part of my life. Right. So she's not trying to butter me up or something. She's just saying how much she appreciated his behavior. And I think, for my daughter, it's also just that, she has kind of a bubbly, almost Disney princess personality about things, but she's also very smart, very capable of standing up for herself when necessary. As people find out when they try to physically bully her and it doesn't work out quite the way they thought.
Right.
But it's also that they're both very intelligent.
Rousey treatment.
What's that?
So she gives them the Ronda Rousey treatment.
Well, yeah, and so does my son, but it's from her. I don't think they expect it. It's not just because of her being a girl. It's because her personality, like I said, is so bubbly, like a fairy or something. That's what you think you're talking to. And then you make the mistake of trying to get physical with her and you find out, nope, that ain't going to work out quite the way you thought it would. With my son, it's kind of obvious that he's athletic and, muscled out and all that. So they mess with him less maybe in that regard. But what I was going to say was, but they're both very intelligent. They usually both listen to my podcast. They're often in my chat, and I realized that when the woke stuff started to make its way into school, I wasn't really worried about whether or not it would affect them. It was more of a matter of, I knew I was going to be getting letters from teachers because my son and my daughter would not put up with that, and they would argue with them about it and they would not be afraid to do so, and I was at that point more worried about, are they going to get disciplined because they're not going along with the 1619 project saying that the Revolutionary War was fought to preserve slavery or something crazy
Right.
like that. And I'd say the final one would be the day that my son said, Dad, I'd like to borrow some money. Of course, then you're thinking to yourself as a parent, okay, what's this about, right? And he said, I'd like to go buy a snow shovel and then I'll pay you back out of the money I make. And I'm like, all right, cool, And so not only did he do that, he also bought pizza for the family. And then he earned enough money to buy himself a nice gaming computer and a BB gun and a bunch of other things. And I remember setting up a Facebook account for him to be able to use Facebook Marketplace to advertise his service. And there were so many adults that were just astonished that any kid was still doing that.
I would be, because, that's something I did when I was his age. And it was common. It does not seem that common these days. So yeah, I applaud him definitely for doing that. And it's no wonder he made that kind of money. There's no competition.
Well, right. No, there is that, but he busted his butt, and I
Right.
think that it really just comes down to the fact that I use sports as kind of an analogy for life. You put in this work, you get this reward, right? And so, but I didn't have to talk him into doing that. That was his scheme from the beginning, which was, I'm going to create a business for myself. I'm going to own that business. I'm going to produce, and even calculate how much money he was making and all of that stuff and how long it would take him to achieve his goals. And that was more or less, then I said, I'm not saying that I didn't have anything to do with it, because obviously I helped to instill those values in him. But at the same time, at that point, I didn't have to hold his hand through that process. He made that decision, right? And unfortunately, there are a lot of kids who don't do that anymore, right? And I think it's largely because parents just kind of hand them everything. And, so those were probably the moments as a father that I feel that were the most prevalent. And, and my daughter did the same thing with babysitting. She has some physical limitations now, unfortunately, that she wouldn't be able to do kind of manual work anymore. But, it's just also when you hear them, listen to them debate. Do you have any teenagers yet?
My oldest stepson is 13, so yeah, and then his younger sister is 2 years younger at 11.
So, when they start to get to the point that they could start having in-depth conversations with them, you're gonna really enjoy that part of parenting, I guess.
Yeah, it already is a great part. I mean, as a 13-year-old, he's very intelligent and he's a very nice kid. And it is great to have conversations with him. He's very smart, like I said. And it's just fascinating to talk to him sometimes. Sometimes it's funny, his philosophy on things is still like, oh, you're young, you'll learn. But that's part of life. And you had me thinking when you were talking about the kids and particularly school and everything. My youngest was in kindergarten, and we were so worried about him. We were going to get letters from teachers for discipline issues, because at home he can just be a problem child.
Where did you get that from?
Yeah,
I'm
his
sorry,
uncle Dan,
right? Of course,
for my brother.
right,
No, he does. When I talk to my mom, he's got a lot of like reminds my mom and I a lot of what my brother was like when my brother was a kid.
right,
Where my middle child reminds me of me when I was a kid. I'd go off and play with my toys for hours, and parents would forget I was there.
right.
But my oldest one is in constant need of attention, and he's, like I said, he's hard-headed. And so, you tell him no not to do something, and you're at the sixth time telling him no with your voice raised so the neighborhood can hear you. And I'm like, oh my God, this kid's going to have so many letters coming home. Quite the opposite. The school loves him. He's not bad at school. He even hates missing school. He won't let us, even when he's sick, keep him home. If we didn't keep him home the one day this year, he would have perfect attendance. And when we meet with the teachers, they just talk about how pleasant he is, how respectful and nice he is. And I'm like, I'm always like, we're talking about my son, right?
That makes you want to meet the teachers. I'll bet you they're really good at it.
They
you might
are.
have gotten really lucky. That's what it sounds like.
Again, this charter school that they go to is, it's great. We love it. So if we couldn't send them to that, they'd get homeschooled. And so they're saving us a lot of a headache of trying to homeschool this kid by being there. And they're just, he went in there, bottom of his class, and he came out of kindergarten already at a first grade level. So, at the end of the year when we met to the teacher, she said, "You're more than ready for first grade, buddy." And I was like, man, this is great. Thank you for not having letters come home every other day for discipline issues.
Well, and I hope you communicated that, because that kid needs to know, wow, I guess I'm doing something really cool, right?
Oh, of course. We tell him how proud we are of him, how great that is that he does that. Yeah, of course we communicate it.
And that's
sure.
why, I tell people now, and I think this is a good way to kind of cap things off here, is just that being a dad is not a problem. Being a dad is great, right?
Yes.
There are other problems that can come about, but I would never tell anybody I would tell people to be selective about who they have kids with, like we mentioned earlier. But you should definitely have kids. And the other thing that I usually tell young parents now is that, like, I remember a friend of mine, he just got lucky as the perfect wife, right? And the perfect, like, he's got a house, he's got everything straightened out. And I was asking him, like, when are you gonna have kids? He's like, well, I don't know. And I'm like, what are you waiting for? Like, I was like, well, financially, I'm like, financially, you own your own house, you have 2 cars. Like, what are you waiting for? Like, because they expect there to be this perfect financial utopia that just doesn't exist, right? And if you wait too long, you end up in a situation like me. My body is destroyed. I can coach my kid in wrestling, but I can't physically do it with him.
Yeah, I had mine late in life in terms of that. I was, 37, 38 when I had my first one. And so, yeah, I'm back at the gym now, making sure I get in shape so I can keep up with them as they get older. And I hopefully can keep my health intact for a while.
Right. And that's why I say to people, I'm like, it is rewarding, consider having children. And, I think that could be another conversation we have at another time, because there's definitely a concern right now. Like, Elon Musk talks about the fact that people don't want to have kids anymore. And it's unfortunate, and I think that, we could discuss that at another time. But, if you're out there listening, I know that this was a holiday show. So inevitably that means that a lot of you will be listening later, just like, Daisy, for example, shows up late, better late than never. Just don't ever let it happen again.
Never again, ever.
Right. No, but
there's one time to allow it.
Remember that you're, who your father was. And if maybe your memories of who your father was are not pleasant, then remember that when you decide to be a father. Remember that when you're deciding to be a mother, who it is that you're deciding to be the father of your kids.
Right, exactly. I am blessed that the mother of my children is a wonderful life partner and a wonderful mother. So I will count my blessings every day that I'm with her, and that's the person that I chose to have kids with, for sure.
Good job, man. It's crazy to look back on it now, as long as we've known each other, and friends of ours, for example, have had kids and ended up being, really good parents too. And, it's good to see, how far we've come. And it'll be interesting to see if later on, like, I often think about this. Like, I can remember a lot of my conversations with my mom, but because my kids actually listen to my podcast, it makes me wonder, like, when I've passed on, they'll have this huge archive of thousands of hours of their dad talking,
Right.
you know,
Bad philosophy. Here we go.
and I would just kill to have 20 minutes to talk to my mom again.
Yeah. Yeah. I understand.
So,
Anyway, I noticed that there's still a few people out there who haven't gone over and subscribed to my channel over on YouTube. So it's Liberty Unleashed TV. You have no excuse at this point. Neil obviously is keeping me around, so I'm here.
Right.
So you guys got to get over there and hit that subscribe button. For those of you who are listening from Liberty Unleashed, you do have to come over and subscribe to V Radio, because he's been putting out stuff without me this last couple days. Including an argument about the Punisher.
Yes. Needed to be had.
People argue online about comic books.
Well, right. And the main point about the video was also just to kind of take a moment to teach a lesson in bad, like, argument tactics, because people use the laugh react as on Facebook in particular, or not just Facebook, but they'll do it as if, like, see, I don't even have to argue with you. I can just click the laugh react and not answer anything you said. It's just an attempt to manipulate you. And that was one of the biggest reasons I was like, look at this. My Facebook feed is lighting up with these laugh reacts from people that I guarantee did not take the time to read my posts. But it was also just about the nature of the Punisher is a problem right now, because the left wants to take him away from the right, but the right also has some kind of messed up ideas about him. And the reality is that he's not very friendly to what people want out of their comic books anymore. I mean, nowadays, I still remember, because I have a couple panels of it on my old hard drive. There were a couple of panels of Iron Man where Iron Man's literally in the hospital covered in bandages because he almost died defending a city. And the female character Hellcat is lecturing him about his white privilege. And I was just like, what the hell is this about? And then, of course, he married her, right? So that's where comic books are at. And a guy like the Punisher, is not somebody that fits into the current worldview of, well, the criminals are actually the victims and the cops are definitely the bad guys. It doesn't work for them, and that's one of the reasons why a lot of us feel that's why they killed him off, because they really didn't have anywhere to put this character, because, people like Jacob Blake or Dante Wright, you wouldn't have to worry about the cops because they'd already been dead if the Punisher existed. It's a conversation for another time. I also did another one on the fact that we had another WeSpa situation where a trans person has now gotten a judge to order a all-female nude spa to admit pre-op trans biological men, like whether they want to or not. And the business has decided, I'm sure this was making your libertarian radar go off, right?
Yeah.
The business has decided that they're going to continue their lawsuit all the way to the Supreme Court if necessary. I will be following that story, but those are the two little videos that I did before my stream yesterday, reviewing Dan Crenshaw and his bill to try to remove any kind of funding from any children's hospital that engages in gender affirming care. And the arguments that ensued were pretty crazy. You guys can check that out on my channel. And, I definitely look forward to doing some more work with you, Brian, going forward. I think we're still trying to settle we're going to talk about something going on in the Republican and the Libertarian Party next week, right?
I think we're going to probably do that subject. I'm going to make some calls tomorrow to solidify that. But yeah, there's seemed to be some deal made with the Republican and Libertarian Party that I find worth discussing. It's rather interesting. If we can't get the guest to come on, we might consider the show. Otherwise, we'll announce. We'll let people know what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, and then also, guys, if you haven't already, join my Discord, and Liberty Unleashed is going to have their own Discord too. But we both participate in it, and you can, if you have ideas about modern events that you want to talk about, we exchange links all the time in our Discord, and the Discord just has one rule. It's like no personal attack. You're allowed to do whatever else you want. You can be a leftist, rightist, whatever. I've only ever kicked somebody out for ideological reasons once, and it was because he said that we should line up and execute migrant children as foreign invaders.
You tyrant, you.
I was like, no, I'm sorry, you're gone.
violation of free speech, but it's your own Discord channel. So
Well, it's part of it is also just though those are the kinds of things. If you let that go on, Discord will take it down. You don't have to worry about me doing it.
Right.
We won't have a server anymore. But
yeah,
other than that, though, I mean, I've had Christian theocrats, I've had authoritarian Republicans, I've had libertarian right wingers, libertarian left wingers, etc., dogs and cats living together, general mass hysteria. So, but just with no personal attack. So you can check out our Discord. And also just like somebody told me the other day, one of my regulars, John Jackson, he said he wasn't notified of my recent stream. I also get told all the time that people have mysteriously been unsubscribed and they are not the ones who clicked the button. So if you want to be sure that you're going to get my stuff, make sure that you, for one thing, go to v-radio. Sorry, actually, no, I don't use that one anymore. hy.page/vradio. Which you will see, in the links here. In there, you will find all of my Rumble, my BitChute, and all the other places. Because the other thing is like I said, my friend Neo Unrealist just got his channel just completely deleted, and the only thing he was doing was covering the Hunter Biden laptop story. So it's like, the hell did you do that for, right? Like, he's over on Rumble now only. So I do this for the sake of redundancy. Probably going to be going live on Rumble again. I have to figure out how, but I believe it's a monthly charge. We'll see.
I am on Rumble as well. It's Liberty Unleashed over there on Rumble. If you prefer to watch us on Rumble, I don't broadcast live on Rumble right now. It's just whatever comes on YouTube will get posted there within 24 hours.
Right.
But I do have all my other videos as well over on Rumble. So if you prefer Rumble or do both YouTube and Rumble, please feel free to head over to Rumble and look up Liberty Unleashed and give it a subscribe as well.
So that's a good place to stop, guys. Thank you very much for tuning in today. And, I'm glad that you guys were here to support us. Again, I know it's a holiday, so some of you are probably literally having dinner with your dads, or something. And I appreciate that. So just listen to it later. That's one of the benefits of the internet, is you guys can listen to things on demand.
And God save the Queen.
Yeah, that too. Meaning the band, not the actual Queen.
Right, exactly.
All right, everybody. You guys take care, and thanks for tuning in.
Have a great day, everybody.